Hi, it's Charlie Zeiss with Stargate Pyramids and the Pyramid Science Foundation. Today is part two in our series of the geometric links between the Russian pyramids and the Platonic solids. It's taken me quite a while longer to get this second video out to the public, and that's largely due, the good news is, to some amazing discoveries that I have made that I'm going to be talking about today. Which truly provide some insights and into a dynamic model that, to my knowledge, has never been put forth before, and that's a model that will demonstrate and integrate the progression of the Platonic solids with the geometry of the Stargate Pyramid, of the Phi Scaling Angle, and the Torus. So that's something that I have never seen in print before, and I'm excited to be able to demonstrate this model to you. I think it's something that I have felt has been missing sort of in this whole realm of attempting to put together kind of a unified model of how the creative process really works. So it's a pretty ambitious undertaking. That's why I wanted to take some extra time to develop this, to get as many of the kinks out of it as I possibly could. And so I'm ready to, to show it to everyone today. So it's gonna, I hope you can hang in there with me. This is gonna take a little while, but we're gonna try to make it as non-mathematical as possible for most of you. And for those of you interested in the math, there is some, the key places. I'll go through the math very briefly so you can follow along. But anyway, let me open up and we'll get started. This again is part two of the geometric links between the Russian pyramids and the Platonic solids. Since it's been a while, I wanted to review for a little bit the information that we discussed in part one. For those of you who want to go back or who haven't seen this before, I would recommend going back to part one for more information. But in summary, we found out that the knowledge of the Platonic forms dates back to the ancient Vedic texts at least 18,000 years ago. And in fact, even in Europe, ancient stone carvings of the Platonic forms date back to 3000 BCE, and they've been found in England, Scotland, and Ireland. And that's actually about 2,500 years before the time of Plato, for whom these forms are named. Johannes Kepler introduced a theory of the solar system based on the nesting of the Platonic forms in the late 16th century. And this nesting idea, as we're going to find out, has stuck with us for a long time since then, and it may have actually been influential in blocking us from seeing or conceptualizing the progression of the Platonic forms in a dynamic model, which I'll be demonstrating later in the presentation. Now, Buckminster Fuller more recently has developed a comprehensive theory regarding the progression of the Platonic forms based on spiraling torsion waves as the propelling force. And for those of you who watched the video in part one, you saw a demonstration that I played of actually Buckminster Fuller demonstrating his structure of the progression in the previous video. And then finally, at the end of part one, I mentioned that Robert Lawlor, who's the author of Sacred Geometry, Philosophy, and Practice, had in his book laid out some specific side length dimensions of the nested Platonic forms. And that results in a ratio of side length of the outer icosahedron to the inner icosahedron of phi cubed, which happens to perfectly match the ratio of the slant height to base length of the Russian pyramid, the Phi scaling angle, and the torus. So we knew, and that's where we stopped at the end of part one, We knew that that relationship existed. And so I wanted to stop there. And in the interim, I thought I was not going to have this much to talk about today, but since that time, I've had a chance to really put together an understanding of a mysterious and not well-documented diagram that shows up in Robert Lawlor's book on the very last page. And on that page, there's a diagram with 9 concentric circles designating specific radii lengths associated with this diagram of the progression of the Platonic forms. However, when I start, and you'll see this, when I went and actually did the numbers and did the math on this, it didn't match up with the calculations that I got from the model that he had suggested for the nested Platonic solids. So those discrepancies, really had me stumped for a little while. And that's what resulted in a several-week delay in getting this information out. But as you'll see, it's going to be well worth it, because what I did, I spent many, many hours contemplating that form, doing mathematical calculations and so forth. But what I've come to conclude, and what I'll be demonstrating to you today, is that I have, and I put it in parentheses, rediscovered that this diagram is actually a 2-dimensional depiction of a 3D model, dynamic 3D model of the progression of the Platonic solids. So that's what I've got in store for you today. I hope you're going to enjoy it. So the summary of what we're going to do today in part 2, I'm going to be verifying Lawlor's calculations based on the geometric relationships of the nested Platonic forms, and verify that phi cubed geometric relationship. And next, we're going to be developing this model. So the next step I want to do is to demonstrate that using this phi cube geometry as an octave in the scaling process results in what's called a 12-tone equal temperament scale, which is perfect for Phi-based scaling. And I know that's going to take some explanation, but that's going to be step 1. Next, I'm going to be demonstrating that just as the Metatron cube is a 2-dimensional depiction from which you can see all of the Platonic forms, Lawlor's diagram is indeed a 2-dimensional depiction of a dynamic 3D model of the Platonic form progression that incorporates the Russian pyramid, Torus, Phi Scaling Angle Geometry, and 12-tone equal temperament Phi-based scaling. So this results in a dynamic model proving new and unique insights into the steps inherent in the process of the progression of the Platonic forms. So that was a mouthful, but in plain English, what we're going to be doing for the rest of this video, we're going to be looking at the process, which is the progression of the Platonic solids, and we're going to be marrying that or integrating it with the pathway of the torus, the Phi scaling angle, and the Russian geometry pyramid. Pretty exciting stuff. So again, for background, for those of you who haven't seen this, and also for refresher, this diagram on the left was actually the diagram I put together almost 2 years ago now when I was first defining the geometry of the Russian pyramid. And it was a essentially a 2D version of the Phi spiral pyramid that results. And so just to review, we've got on the left diagram here 4 circles, many more than that actually, but the first 4 are marked in terms of their diameter. The first one is a diameter of 1. We divide that by phi, or 1.618, to come up with the diameter of the next one, 0.618, which we again divide by phi to come up with the next diameter of 0.382, 0.236, and so forth. So that's really what I did to develop the geometry. of the Russian pyramid and figure out exactly what it was. So Marshall Lefferts independently came up with what he called at roughly the same time the Phi scaling angle, and that's what I have mentioned up at the top. So the Russian pyramid geometry in 2 dimensions, which is kind of what we have here, is actually equivalent to the Phi scaling angle that Marshall Lefferts developed in his recent book, Cosmometry, exploring the holofractal nature of the cosmos. So in summary, the height of the Russian pyramid, is 4.116 from the right diagram, and the slant height of the pyramid is 4.236. And you can see those numbers if you look on the right-hand picture. CD equals 4.116. That's the height of the Russian pyramid with a base length of 2. And the slant height of the pyramid is 4.236, which is depicted on the right-hand vertical column as CF. So as a way of demonstrating this in essentially 3 dimensions, when I first discovered this, I put together this 3-dimensional logo to show basically what's going on. You've got now spheres instead of just circles, and we have stacked those spheres whose dimension or diameters are decreasing by phi on top of each other, and we essentially just built a pyramid around it and then determined the geometry that we showed on the previous page. And then finally, after I had done that, and I knew that there was a correlation between the geometry of the Russian pyramid and that of the torus, I put this very simplistic picture together. I sort of interposed the Russian pyramid into the picture of a torus. And I didn't really, it seemed to make sense at the time, but really today's discussion is going to tie in how all of this works together. So again, back to where we ended off last in the last part video. The first step in developing the model was that we want to do is to confirm what Robert Lawlor indicated were the dimensions and relationships of the nested Platonic solids. And so on page 103 of his book, Sacred Geometry, Philosophy and Practice, it says that if the cube is given the dimension of 1, the side of the outer icosahedron will equal phi, and the dodecahedron will have a side length of 1 over phi. The interlocking tetrahedron will have a side of the square root of 2. The octahedron will have a side of 1 over the square root of 2, and the side of the new small inner icosahedron will be 1 over phi squared, a stunning constellation of harmonies. So what I've done over on the left, I've just put in kind of a tabular form here what he had said verbally, and you can see that the outer icosahedron has a side length of phi, and the central or inner icosahedron has a dimension of 1 over phi squared. So when you look at, and now we're into the center here, the ratio of the side length of the outer icosahedron to the side length of the central icosahedron is equal to phi divided by 1 over phi squared, and that equals 1.618 divided by 0.38197, and that equals to 5.236, which equals to phi cubed. And now you see the relationship, because that's the slant height of the Russian pyramid. So that's essentially where we left off last week. Now we'll start to get into some of the new data. The mathematics of the nested Platonic forms was the first thing that I told you I was going to be demonstrating for you today. So what I did in this chart, I put this progression in the sequence that Lawlor has depicted it: the inner icosahedron, the octahedron, star tetrahedron, cube, dodecahedron, and then the octave icosahedron again. So this is the progression that Lawlor suggested, along with the side links, which I have in parentheses, at least in terms of their sacred geometry equivalents. Now I've converted those side links into numbers in the next column. And in order to get the radius and the diameter of each of these Platonic solids, I needed to know the relationship of the radius to the side of each of these Platonic forms. So what I did, I've shown you this book in the previous video, but I'm going to hold it up again now. This is Kenneth McLean's book, A Geometric Analysis of the Platonic Solids and Other Semi-Regular Polyhedra. Again, a mouthful, but if you're really interested in studying sacred geometry, he has done just a great job of giving you every possible ratio, calculation, whatever you may want on all of these Platonic forms. And it made this process, which I was expecting to be a very daunting one, very, very simple. So all I had to do was to go into each of these chapters. He has a chapter on each of these and the semi-regular, as they're called, polyhedra, and he's got charts on all this. So all I had to do was go in and look it up. So what I've done is to put the corresponding relationship between the radius to the side length in the next column from his book, and then multiply those together. And so the first thing that I get is the radius, and then the second one, obviously, is when I multiply that by 2, I get the final column, which is the diameter. So I'm able to calculate the radius and diameter for each of these Platonic solids. And sure enough, the relationship stays absolutely the same. I had expected that because there were no what are called second order relationships here. It was all a mathematic or relationship that wasn't going to change those dynamics. So this is what I found. Now let's look at the diameters on the last column for a moment, so you can see what I've done. First of all, you'll see there's colors. I put each of the icosahedron in as a yellow, and then I put the octahedron in as a blue. And then if you'll notice, the star tetrahedron, the cube, and the dodecahedron all end up with the same diameter. And what that means is they're all contained in the nested form within the same sphere. So unlike the icosahedron and the octahedron, the other 3 Platonic solids all share in the nested form a common enclosing or circumscribing sphere. Now, just to show you how this works, and why I call this an octave, you can see the scaling that can go on by just taking this basic information of 1 octave and you continue to expand it out. And so each time you're going to have the icosahedron as a single sphere. You're going to have the octahedron as a single sphere, and you're going to have the star tetrahedron, cube, and dodecahedron as a single sphere, and it's going to continue to repeat and repeat. So, but if you look at the diameter differences, it goes from 0.7 to 3 because we're scaling by a factor of 4.236. And so it doesn't take very long for that scaling to get quite large. As you can see, in 4 octaves, you go from under 1 to over 233 in terms of relative size. So that gives you some perspective on this and shows you that geometry, with the Phi relationships, can grow quite rapidly. So now what I want to do is to go back to the basic model that I showed you before that I used to develop the geometry of the Russian pyramid. All I've done in this case, though, is I've changed the actual dimensions to match those that I came up with Lawlor's nested geometry. So rather than having a bottom diameter of 1, I've now got one that's 3.077 as my starting point. Divided by phi is 1901, divided by phi is 1.18, and divided again by phi is 0.726. Now, if you'll notice, those correspond to, at least in 2 cases, the diameters that show up in Lawlor's nested calculations that I did. So you'll see that the icosahedron 7.726 matches, and the 3.07 matches as well. However, those 2 that are in the middle, the octahedron and the star tetrahedron cube dodecahedron sphere, don't match up. And we're gonna explain all of that as we go through the presentation today. But the important thing to take away from this discussion is that we've now got a framework of the progression of Platonic solids that we can start with. It's kind of like our anchor, which is the octave icosahedra. So what we're going to be doing, the diagram on the left, as I say, shows the octave icosahedra locations, which for those of you who have some interest in the piano, know that it's similar to the C notes on the piano keyboard. Those are the beginnings of the octaves on the piano keyboard. And that's the way you can think about the icosahedra in this scaling octave that we're going to be developing. So they're going to be the anchors, and what we're going to be doing is filling in the blanks that we're going to be discovering during the rest of this video to fill this thing out and get a working model up and running. With that as background, the next step is to talk about harmonics and the interplay of geometry, numbers, and harmonics in the creative process. So numbers, geometry, music, and cosmology are the 4 areas of classical liberal arts contained in the ancient field of study taught by Pythagoras called the quadrivium. Now, study of the quadrivium will lead one, and I've been studying this now for several years, and I just keep getting more and more amazed at this appreciation that all 4 of these disciplines are truly interrelated. Everything is holistic, and they form an interplay that ultimately results in the creation of our physical reality. In other words, numbers can become geometry, and geometry can become vibration, and vibration can become reality, and so forth. And so there's this amazing interplay of all of these various facets. And one of the most wonderful things that I've learned doing all this research is how beautiful this whole interplay really is, and what an amazingly precise and harmonious universe we live in. So to finish up, any model of the creative process must provide an appropriate template for the interconvertibility of numbers, vibration, and harmonics in geometry in order for it to be successful. So that's the key takeaway here. So now I want to tell you just a little bit about what's called equal temperament harmonic scaling. And this is coming largely from the Britannica.com. I've modified it to a large degree, but equal temperament is a musical tuning system which divides an octave or other interval, and that's going to be important here in a minute, into equal steps. What it means is that the ratio of the frequencies of any adjacent pair of notes is the same, which gives an equal perceived step size. Now, what that means is if we have 3 points, we know the first point is 1 and the second one is 2, we would want that intermediate point to be the same to result in the same percentage progression from one point to the next. And that's what we're going to be putting together for this discussion. In classical music and Western music, the most common tuning system has been the 12-tone equal temperament scale, which divides the octave into 12 parts. And this is important, all of which are equal on what's called a logarithmic scale. A 12-tone equal temperament scale based on an octave of Phi cubed allows for Phi-based logarithmic scaling rather than the arithmetic scaling of the traditional musical octave, which doubles the frequency with each octave rather than increasing it by a factor of Phi cubed, or 4.236 times. Now, we've already kind of got an initial model based on the three Phi scaling spheres that we stacked on top of each other, the fourth one if you want to include it for the octave. So all we really need to do to come up with a 12-tone equal temperament scale is to conceptually divide each of those three spheres, or the entire process, by 12. And we're going to end up with a 12-tone equal temperament scale. So we're going to go through the math of that here on the next page, but in summary, nature could not have picked a more appropriate and perfect scaling geometry, and that's why it's used by nature, than the Russian pyramid Phi scaling angle torus geometry, because it ends up resulting in an octave of Phi cubed, which results in Phi-based logarithmic scaling. So that's the key takeaway here. For those of you who are interested in pursuing more information about the interplay of geometry and harmonics, I highly recommend Richard Merrick's Interference book. It's available at interferencetheory.com, which is his website, and it's free. So if you're interested, go get some more information on that. So now this is a math page. So for those of you who want to tune out for a minute, go ahead. But this isn't really hard math. What we're going to see here is this is the page where I derive the mathematics of the 12-tone equal temperament scale converted into geometry. So what we've done, again, we've divided this into 13 pieces, which means there's 12 intervals between those 13 levels. And we've started with the diameter of 3.077 that we said was our bottom diameter of our bottom sphere before, and we're using as the top one 0.726, which is the diameter of the top sphere. Now, the way we actually come up with the radius is just, in each case, is just going to be half the diameter. So the key is going to be developing the diameters, the 12 diameters, and the 12 midpoints for us to complete out this process. So I'll go over with you quickly, what has to be done here to accomplish that. Essentially, for the math geeks, what I've done is I've determined the cube root of Phi, because that's the number when you start with a total area of Phi cubed. If you want to come up with a progression, what you do is you determine the cube root of Phi to make that work. Well, the cube root of Phi in short verse is the number at the top of that column, 1.12783,917. All I did was to divide the first diameter by that number, and I come up with 2.728. Divide that by 1.1278 and come to 2419 and so forth. And you continue that process, and sure enough, you find out that it trues up, which it should, at the 13th. That's why it's nice to have those anchors, because you can make sure your math is right, of 0.726. So we've got the diameters figured out, and therefore we can figure out the radius. That's nothing more than dividing the diameter by 2. The base and the apex we'll figure out in a moment once we've determined the midpoints. Now the midpoint, this one gave me a lot of trouble because I had forgotten that the relationship between the diameters of these and the midpoint was not going to be quite the same, because the midpoint, the diameter of each of the circles and spheres isn't quite exactly where the circle or sphere intersects the pyramid. That point is actually a little bit higher. That's enough said. It's going to change the ratio just a little bit, and as you can see, it changes that ratio from 4.236 to 4.234, which is not major, but when you're trying to get precision, it was causing havoc for me for a long time. But I figured this out. Now, I did that one in reverse. I took the 6.516, which I have as the midpoint of level 13. That's, again, my anchor octave. And I divided and went down for that, and I divided by actually 1.127804, and I did the same thing. So that's the way I came up with my midpoints. The base and the apex are simple to derive once you have the midpoints. All you do for the base is you subtract whatever the radius is from the midpoint in that level to come up with the base, and you add the radius to the midpoint to come up with the apex. So enough of the math. Now let's show you what this looks like in real life. I wanted to give you this quote because I'm gonna be talking about the importance of this course. I actually did a video promoting this. I get nothing out of it, but the Unified Science course that the Resonance Science Foundation puts together is fantastic. It was actually the key to this whole discovery that I'm going to be showing you. But one of the quotes that was in there that I saw that was particularly relevant before I show you this picture was from Buckminster Fuller. And he says, when I am working on a problem, I never think about beauty, but when I'm finished, if the solution is not beautiful, I know it's wrong. So with that said, I want to show you how beautiful this diagram of this 12-step equal temperament harmonics is when it's actually scaled out and mapped out in GeoGebra. So if you look at the left-hand column, I mean, to me, I get a visual feeling. That's a two-dimensional object, but I get a feeling like I'm kind of looking into a three-dimensional cone, so to speak, that's going out at kind of like a 45-degree angle from me, but I'm able to see into part of it. And so this is so beautiful. And as you can see, I did a close-up here. The apex of each of the lower spheres or circles is going to end up being the base of another higher harmonic of this. So this just demonstrates, mathematically and visually, the beauty of harmony and this scaling in particular. So anyway, that's what this is going to look like, and this is going to be the template that we're going to be using. And again, now we have the harmonics built in, and we've got the octaves established with our icosahedra. So now we've developed that, and that's our pathway. Again, to use that analogy, we've got our pathway established. Now let's see if we can integrate the process of the progression of the Platonic solids to fit within this pathway. So let's get going. Again, a digression, but this is going to be important to understand. I want to give you some information about Robert Lawlor, who's the author of this book, and in particular, this specific diagram that we're going to be using as the basis to develop this, this dynamic model. Robert Lawlor is the author of several books, including Sacred Geometry, Philosophy and Practice. That's the one at the top that we're going to be showing the diagram from. Voices of the First Day, and more recently, The Sacred Geometry of the End of Time. Now, I ended up buying that book. I haven't read it yet. I bought it in the hopes that since it was self-published, he might have, as Kenneth McLean was nice enough to do, contact information so I could get in touch with him, but he doesn't. So he's still an enigma. He's the mystery man, and we'll see what I'm talking about in a minute. But he wrote, he was formerly an artist living in New York, and he discovered the works of R.A. Schwaller de Lubitz and moved to France because he was fascinated by the information in de Lubitz's books. And after studying with Schwaller's daughter, Lucy Lamy, Robert and his wife, Deborah, went on to translate several of de Lubitz's works into English, including the voluminous Temple of Man series. So he's currently living in Australia, but suffice it to say, Lawlor has a lot of information that he had gleaned over the years, and I'm sure that since he wrote this Sacred Geometry book almost 40 years ago in 1982, he's got even a lot more that he could share with us. But you know, what I want to point out is I've tried very hard to get in touch with him. When you see and you'll see the reason why in here in a minute, but I haven't been able to do that. But I think I've cracked the code on this, so you know, maybe we don't need him after all. But anyway, all right, now for the diagram that I've been talking about for so long. This is Lawlor's Platonic Forms diagram, and this shows up on the very last page of the Sacred Geometry book. When you look at it, you see a bunch of circles, and you see some of the Platonic forms kind of in there, and it's not really complete, and you know, I'm not sure what to make of it. There's no, I can see down here that he's got specific links that it looks like he's measuring these circles or spheres with, and that's really about all we get. On this page, at the top, I'm going to tell you, give you verbatim the only paragraph of information that's available from his book on this diagram. And it says, these same 5 regular volumes are classically drawn in such a way that they are contained within 9 concentric circles, with each solid touching the sphere which circumscribes the next solid within it. The design will yield many important relationships and is derived from the discipline called corpo transparente of contemplating the shapes constructed of transparent material placed one within the other. And this instruction was given to many of the great men of the Renaissance, including Leonardo da Vinci, Brunelleschi, Giorgi, by Fra Luca Paciolo. Now, I'm going to stop here. It's just to kind of break this up for a little bit, because in my business school curriculum in accounting, I learned that Fra Luca Pacioli was actually the inventor of double entry bookkeeping. And so when I saw this name again, I hadn't heard of it in years. I said, well, let me go check and see if that's accurate. And turns out it's not. So my expensive Ivy League MBA isn't really worth much. But anyway, with that digression over, I want to just tell you, you know, this further information, and this is after contemplation of this for weeks. Surprisingly, and this is surprising to me now that I know what I know, this is the only information about the diagram provided by Lawlor in the book. Lawlor provides no information on the instructional key to the diagram, gives no context or hints as to the hidden information within this diagram. And given his extensive study and translation of Schwaller's work, which I'm sure gave him a lot of insights, and I would expect maybe this that I figured out as well, I wonder whether he knew of the hidden information I'll be presenting shortly and chose not to disclose it, or whether he too was unaware of the hidden meanings contained in this diagram. So this is an enigma for me, folks, and I don't know the answer to any of those questions. But as I said before, I attempted to contact his publisher. I phoned them, sent them an email, got no answers. And I also bought his new book, hoping to get contact information from him as well, but to no avail. So one thing I will do to start with is I want to give you at least the missing definitions of what each of these means. For those of you who are really interested in following up on this, I would get a copy of the book and you know, look at it. It's hard. This is not a good copy. I took it actually from another website. I tried to scan it. My scanner's not very good, but you know, you need a copy of it where you can look at this holistically, that you can actually see in order to make these relationships. But I will have done that for you. Just trust me, but if you want to see it for yourself, go ahead. Anyway, the missing definitions, the capital R is the circumscribing sphere that we've been talking about for each of the Platonic forms. Small p is the interior sphere. Now, what does that mean? If I've got an object like this pyramid, and if it's touching on the inside, that would be the interior sphere definition. Small r is the radius of the Platonic form, and small a is the side length of the Platonic form. And no definitions whatsoever, but after a lot of study, I figured that out. So with that said, I'm going to start first by doing the same process that I did with the nested dimensions, which are shown above. I want to figure out the dimensions of the forms when I take the radius of each of these forms that's presented in the diagram, and see what shows up as differences. And there are differences, and that's the key reason for doing this. Now, if you look, you'll see that going up at the top, the side length, again, what I did, in the second case, I took the radius as the given, and I developed from that, given the same relationships of radius to side, I was able to develop the side length and diameter of the Platonic forms with respect to the dimensions given in the diagram. So now you'll see, again, the yellow sphere, 0.3633 and 0.7266, those are the same. They're the same for the octave. And the blue sphere for the octahedron, that turns out to be the same, 1/2 for the radius and 1 for the diameter. But all of a sudden you say, whoa, wait, what's going on here? The dimensions of the diameter and radius of the three interior or middle sphere forms, the star tetrahedron, cube, and dodecahedron, are different. And the diameter, you can see, is in each case is 2.44 instead of 1.73. Well, you do a simple math calculation and you say, oh, look at that. It's a factor of the square root of 2, or 1.414. That's the multiplier. So the key takeaway here, when you do the math between the nested geometry sizes and those available from this diagram, are that they're different, and specifically the diameter, radius, and side length of each Platonic form, shown in green, which is the central sphere in the progression, all increased by the square root of 2. So the question that I came up with, you know, first thought, hey, he made a mistake. Well, obviously that I realized that wasn't the case, but you know, I always like to start that way, thinking I can find an easy way out, but that was not to be. So the key questions that truly come out of this are, why is this so? And I mean, that's a very simple and you know, appropriate question. And if they're not the same, how could that occur? Why would that be? So I was asking all of those questions. So with that in mind, I'm going to go back now to the Resonance Science Unified Science course. And this is section 2.3.10. They're talking about the Renaissance scientists of the day, Descartes in particular, and the use of Cartesian geometry. And what this brings up is part of the key problem that Nassim Haramein sees in our worldview today is that we think in 2 dimensions rather than thinking in 3 or 4 dimensions and expanding kind of our awareness of things. So I just want to read to you some of the information from here, because this was what caused the aha moment for me. He said, Nassim says, although the 2-dimensional reduction from the 3 and 4-dimensional geometry is useful for mathematical conceptualization, the user forgets that they are conceptualizing a 2D geometry out of a 3D structure. Then the physical significance is lost in terms of the physics and the structure of the dynamics of the subject being studied. And, you know, another explanation on that same page, while the Cartesian coordinate plane is a powerful mathematical tool, it is another system, such as Euclidean geometry, in which operations are performed in 2-dimensional space. This 2-dimensional mathematical model has severely misconstrued the conceptual basis from which mainstream academia and research perform science, even to this day inevitably leading to inaccurate and erroneous conclusions in certain critical areas. Well, I started thinking about this in the context of this diagram, and I knew that I was getting different results from that than when I did the mathematics than you get when you nest the solids. So I started to think, could this be, and this is where the aha moment comes in, what if Lawlor's diagram, similar to Metatron's cube for the Platonic forms, which is a 2-dimensional representation of all of the 3D Platonic forms, is actually a 2-dimensional representation of a 3-dimensional model. So that was the key to unlocking this diagram. And I went on to say, if Lawlor's diagram is actually a view from the bottom, let's go back for a minute so now you can think about this diagram in a different way. If you consider yourself, if you pretend you're sitting in the bottom of one of my pyramids and you're looking up and you see all of this in 3 dimensions. That's what I saw. And I said, that's got to be it. So anyway, with that realization, you know, I went on, I missed my place here, but I said, could this 3-dimensional model be able to be successfully integrated into integrate the process of the progression with the pathway that we've developed? So that's what the rest of this is going to be about. Let's find out right now. So the first step in this process is converting Lawlor's 2-dimensional diagram to 3D. I've done that here. I don't want to lose the non-math majors. For those of you who are interested in how I develop the mathematics, all of the calculations are here. You can stop the tape right now and you'll be able to figure this out. But we're going to move on so that everyone can kind of stay on the same page and we don't lose the people who aren't interested in the math. But what this does is it plots those 9 circles into 3 dimensions and determines how to do that. So this is the visual result of plotting the Lawlor diagram in 3 dimensions. Each of the 9 circles and spheres fit perfectly, and I mean perfectly, within the 76.345 degree slant angle geometry of the pyramid. And again, it's the same as the Phi scaling angle and the dimensions of the torus. So particularly since we already know that the anchor octave icosahedron fit within this geometry, it's impossible for me to imagine that the slant angle dimensions of the torus, the scaling angle, were not known by the original people who put this together in 2 dimensions. It just can't be. But I'm going to show you one other additional point of confirmation, which is a clincher for me. when you go back and look at that diagram or in 3 dimensions that I just put together, you're going to find that there are 2 intersections that are perfectly matched. And that is the apex of the interior sphere of the dodecahedron. You don't really need to understand all this right yet, but just know that the chances of this happening are virtually non-existent or nil, of it being an accident. But that apex matches the base of the circumscribing sphere of the octahedron. Now, the reason why that's important, the 2 green figures above represent those figures, but the fact that these 2 spheres have an intersecting base and apex is not at all apparent from the 2-dimensional diagram that Lawlor puts together, because it's only drawn in 2 dimensions. However, it becomes apparent when drawn in 3 dimensions. And here's the key takeaway. That intersection of base and apex could only occur when mapping the spheres inside of a 76.345 degree pyramid. Because if it were anything different, the point of touching of the spheres or circles inside the pyramid would dislocate that, and those 2 points, those 2 circles would not be able to have a common apex and base. So this is a very, very significant point to me. So all of this information is pointing to me that they knew exactly what was going on when they put this together hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. So now I want to start talking about static versus dynamic progression. I was hung up on this for a long time because just like you, I'm thinking 2 dimensions. I'm thinking like Kepler, he had all of these Platonic forms stuffed into a sphere. And so I was thinking of this just like, the stacking of these Russian dolls inside of each other. And I wasn't thinking dynamic. And that's where we've got to break out of that 2-dimensional thinking. So now we're going to start talking about the static versus dynamic progression model. So a good way to demonstrate that the diagram that we've just done in 3 dimensions is depicting a dynamic progression is to compare the 4 major circles encompassing the octave of progression, and the 3 spheres of forms to a similar plotting of the nested circles. And when we do that in 3 dimensions, we see some very significant and important differences. So I plotted those here on this page. Now on the left, again, just for reference, this is the Phi sphere geometry that we developed early on with the octahedron base and, octave at the top. Now, instead of having the 2 perfect Phi spheres in the middle, which we took out, if you remember in that diagram for the question mark, I've still got them here, but now what we're seeing is those 2 spheres projected out in 3 dimensions for both the nested sphere case and the diagram sphere case. Now, that's not going to make a lot of sense. You're going to say, well, what am I supposed to see here? Well, let's go over to the next page that I put together, and I think we'll go back to this in a minute, and you'll see why that diagram is significant. And the question that I'm posing here is the diagram a method of action for dynamic progression? Is it plotting for that? Well, here's some of my premises, and the first 2 are pretty straightforward. The geometrical boundaries of the pyramid are in fact the same as those of the torus and the Phi scaling angle. So we're all in sync on that. The second one, the spiraling torsion field powering the toroidal field is coming up from the bottom, applying pressure to the spheres, or in the words of Buckminster Fuller, to the vector equilibrium which contains the spheres. So those are pretty straightforward. And now this is the one where reasonable people may differ, but I have to believe that once you think about this, that you're going to see why I'm saying this should not give people a lot of trouble conceptually. When compressed, each sphere will morph or change in some fashion into a new sphere or form to fill the space available to it within the limitations of the geometry, the structure of the torus pyramid geometry. And why I'm saying that, and now let's go back and think about that. I say nature abhors a vacuum. If you look at the nested spheres, there is no connectivity between the first sphere and the second sphere, which contains the square, the tetrahedron, and the dodecahedron. So nature would not allow that to happen, because that would be as if the as I say here in the conclusions, in the nested sphere scenario, it would not be logical to assume that a second sphere or vector equilibrium would just kind of float up to a new level in the presence of the spiraling torsion field. If you remember when we saw the video from that Buckminster Fuller did, there's constant pressure being put on this. And the vector equilibrium itself is not strong. It's not really even a true form. It's an energy configuration which, with the slightest application of energy, as he proved in that diagram, is going to morph or change into something else. So to go back, if you see the diagram spheres, the four important ones, the second sphere or circle is actually occurring from within the initial sphere or circle. Now I know that we have the same problem going forward, but we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But I want to get this concept down that you can't have open spaces in this progression. It doesn't make sense to me, and I hope that it doesn't make sense to others, but I truly do want commentary on whether someone thinks that could, can explain how that could actually occur given the facts and circumstances. But anyway, I've talked about what I think is conclusion number one, that you can't do that. And then second, I'm saying, well, now that since we see that the nested model does not make sense in a dynamic model, it's logical to assume that Lawlor's diagram is in fact a 2D depiction of the dynamic process of progression. So that's my tentative conclusion, and I'm now going to walk us through the reasons why I make that conclusion and feel that it's true. Now let's talk about the role of the additional 5 spheres in this process. And so this is where I think things really hit home. I've taken the 9 spheres, I've still got the 4 original ones in solids, and the other 5 are the ones with the dotted line designations. So here's what I believe is happening. Unlike the nested forms, where all 3 forms fit inside 3 discrete spheres, all 9 spheres in the Lawlor diagram are necessary to depict the dynamic progression of the Platonic forms. And that's my thesis. And I can't wait to get comments on this. But what I've done is to put together a summary of each stage of this 9-step progression as outlined in this diagram from Robert Lawlor, and I've done that on the next page. So each stage, as I say in the final sentence, is an essential part of a cascading progression. So let's move on now to the last page, which shows the role of the 9 spheres and the 9 stages of progression. So When we go from sphere 1 to sphere 2, you can see the change in the sphere radius is from 1.5388 to 1.309. And I give a description in each case. In that case, what's happening is the circumscribing sphere of the icosahedron is falling away, giving rise to the interior sphere of the icosahedron. And then in the next step, the interior sphere of the icosahedron falls away, giving rise to the circumscribing sphere of the dodecahedron, cube and tetrahedron, which I call the DCT sphere. The next step, the DCT sphere falls away, giving rise to the interior sphere of the dodecahedron. Then the interior sphere of the dodec falls away, giving rise to the interior sphere of the cube. That falls away, giving rise to the radius of the dodecahedron, which in turn falls away, giving rise to the circumscribing sphere of the octahedron, giving rise to the interior sphere of the octahedron, giving rise again to the radius of the tetrahedron and octahedron, and finally that giving way to the rise of the circumscribing octave sphere of the icosahedron. So using that model, each and every one of these circumscribing spheres, at least it's my belief, that represents a separate phase in this cascading progression of the Platonic solids through the octave, from icosahedron to the next icosahedron. So that, in summary, is kind of what I put together. It's elegant, and I've got to say, to my knowledge, it's the first time that there's actually been a model that's been developed that fully integrates a dynamic progression of the Platonic forms, the geometry of the torus, Phi scaling angle, Phi spiral, and does it with a geometry that results in 12-tone equal temperament Phi-based harmonic scaling. So to me, one of the fascinating things is that the information to do this, I'm grateful to the universe for giving me, or to Nassim for giving me the insight to look at things in 3D. But the fascinating thing to me is that this information has been hiding in plain sight for centuries, and has even been in print since Lawlor's book came out 40 years ago, and may have been in print far before that. But yet nobody seems to have looked at this or rediscovered this information. And I think it really is due to the fact that we continue to think in 2 dimensions rather than 3 and 4 dimensions, as Nassim indicates. So in summary, too, these insights are going to require and demand a major reorientation of the focus of my book, and a significant, augmentation of the subject matter that's going to be included in it. But anyway, I'm sure that there are many refinements and enhancements that can and will improve this model, and I am looking forward to getting comments, critical or positive, and I appreciate the feedback, because the reason I'm doing this is to help all of us to understand and to develop a model which I think has been missing for a long time, how to integrate the pathway with the process. So I'd love to see somebody, I don't have the talent to do this, but to develop a dynamically visual model of what I'm talking about, similar to what Kenneth McLean's done, with his nested Platonic forms. I've given you, a link there. If you have any interest, you can see kind of what I'm thinking about as a way to depict this. So if anyone's interested in doing that, I'd be happy. I'd love to have somebody to work with to try to develop this model dynamically. And then finally, if there's any interest in group discussion on this topic, if you got questions, if you have comments, and you'd like to talk about it, and if there's a sufficient interest in this, then I'll be happy to set up a Zoom meeting where we can all talk about it, and hopefully enhance what I think is a decent framework for further discussion. So I hope this has been helpful to everyone. It's been a very exciting experience for me to have the chance to put this information together. And as always, every time I get into one of these endeavors, I end up learning so much from the process, and I'm grateful to have the chance to relay the information that I've been able to put together to each of you. So as always, we thank you for watching, and you have a great day. Hi, I want to thank all of you who are active participants and listen to the research videos that I've been doing over the last few years. It's really a joy for me to be able to do this in-depth scientific research and find these wonderful new connections with the Russian geometry pyramids and the cutting edge science that's going on in the world around us today. To help me continue that process and to continue the research work that we're beginning at the Pyramid Science Foundation, we would appreciate any and all contributions to our effort. If you go to pyramidsciencefoundation.org, please hit the contribute button at the bottom and make your donation. It's much appreciated and tax deductible. And also the way that I continue to make money while I do this research and begin the process of compiling all of this into my upcoming book is through the sale of my pyramids. So we also appreciate any and all purchases of our pyramids. Caduceus coils, Lisa's work as well is available on stargatepyramids.com. There you can buy the pyramids, caduceus coils, and capstones that the two of us provide. So once again, we thank you for watching, and you have a great day.